right, I'll go ahead and introduce our first presenter. So this is Deziah Bermudez. She's a doctoral candidate, obviously in human development and family science. Her major professor is Dr. Gonzalez-Bakken, and her presentation today is called Acculturative Stress and Risky Behaviors, the Possible Moderating Roles of Parental Monitoring and Gender.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. All right, good morning, everybody. As Katie said, my name is Deziah Bermudez, and today I will be discussing the link between a culture of stress and risky behaviors among Latinx youth, as well as the possible moderating roles of parental monitoring and gender. I just wanted to state that I have no conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. So to begin, acculturation is the process of social and cultural change that one goes through when they're trying to maintain aspects of their culture of origin, while also trying to adapt to the dominant culture of the society in which they live in. With that being said, a culture of stress is experienced when difficulties arise concerning these acculturative processes, such as having difficulties with language or having cultural values or practices that don't really align with the dominant culture. This form of stress has been linked to negative behavior such as rule breaking and substance abuse among Latinx adolescents. Risky behaviors was understood in the current study as rule breaking and binge drinking. And because Latinx adolescents have been found to be more likely to drink alcohol and use drugs than their white and Black counterparts, it was an important variable to include in this study. Parental monitoring was understood in the current study as the extent to which parents monitor different aspects of their children's lives. And it has been found to be a protective factor for adolescent outcomes such that higher levels of parental monitoring were associated with lower levels of problem behaviors. However, these results have been found to have gender-based differences. It's been found that parental monitoring was more effective in decreasing problem behaviors for boys than for girls. And this could be a result of Latinx cultural gender norms. Typically, girls are expected to stay in home and fulfill family obligations, while boys are left to be free and leave and explore the world. And this can alter the youth's perception of parental monitoring and therefore its influence. So the current study had three main research questions with three related hypotheses. So our first hypothesis was that higher levels of a culture of stress would be associated with higher levels of risky behaviors. Our second hypothesis was that parental monitoring would serve as a protective factor such that those who reported higher levels of parental monitoring would also report lower levels of risky behaviors. And lastly, we expected that there would be gender differences, not only in the association between the culture of stress and risky behaviors, but also in the influence of parental monitoring on this association. So the sample consisted of 198 Latinx adolescents from farm worker communities in South Georgia and North Florida. The majority of the sample reported being born in the United States, with others being born in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And the majority of participants also reported being of Mexican ethnic origin. This was a community-based design where bilingual interviewers administered the surveys, which were available in both English and Spanish. The majority of participants decided to take it in English, and they received a $20 compensation for their participation. We used four main measures for this study, the first being the multidimensional acculturative stress inventory, where higher scores were indicative of higher levels of acculturative stress. We also had a 6-item parental monitoring scale, where higher scores were indicative of higher levels of parental monitoring. Our risky behavior variable was created by finding a composite score of rule breaking and binge drinking because they were scaled on the same scale. The rule breaking measure was 35 items, and higher scores indicated more frequent rule breaking behaviors. And adolescents were also asked how many times in the past year they had had 4 or more consecutive drinks, such as beer, wine, shots of liquor, etc. And higher scores on this scale indicated more frequent binge drinking behaviors. All of these measures were validated and found to be reliable among Latinx samples. Okay, so for my analysis, I conducted a hierarchical regression in SPSS with a significance value set at 0.05. So this analytical model breaks down a regression into steps where the variables that you put into one step are controlled for in the following step, and so on and so forth. So in the first step, I entered my covariates. In the second step, I entered my predictors here. In the third step, I entered my interaction variables, which were created by finding the product of the predicted variables of interest. And then in the fourth step, I entered my three-way interaction between gender, stress, and monitoring. So we found that there was a positive association between the culture of stress and risky behaviors. However, this association was only significant in step 2, meaning that it was conditional. We only found it to be significant for boys. We also found that there was a significant interaction between a culture of stress and parental monitoring. However, this interaction was also conditional, being that it was only significant in our third step. And lastly, we found a significant three-way interaction between a culture of stress, gender, and parental monitoring. such that there was a positive association between the culture of stress and risky behaviors among boys who reported low levels of parental monitoring. And I will further explain these in the next following slides. Okay, so on the left, you can see the interaction between culture of stress and gender, such that when there are high levels of a culture of stress, we see that males have higher levels of risky behaviors. And on the right, we can see the interaction between the culture of stress and parental monitoring. So again, if we look over here where there are high levels of a culture of stress and also high levels of parental monitoring, we can see the decrease in risky behaviors and the lower levels of risky behaviors overall. And lastly, we have our three-way interaction effects. So when you look at over here, where there's a high culture of stress, you see that females overall have lower levels of risky behaviors. And if you look up here at top, where the males have low parental monitoring, they have the highest overall levels of risky behaviors, therefore showing that significant three-way interaction. Okay, so our first hypothesis was supported such that there were there was a significant association between a culture of stress and risky behaviors. And this is consistent with previous research. However, as I stated before, this was conditional as it was only found to be significant for boys. Our second hypothesis was also supported such that parental monitoring was found to be a protective factor. And this is also consistent with previous studies where parental monitoring was found to be especially important for reducing risk for conduct problems for those who were experiencing high culture stress. But again, this was also conditional as it was only found to be significant for boys. And then the gender differences we found are also consistent with previous research that has shown an association between gender and a culture of stress, where a culture of stress has been shown to be more impactful for boys. And then, as I mentioned before, the nature of parents' control may differ for boys and girls because of the cultural gender norms. So Latinx girls tend to receive higher supervision and restriction, which may alter their perception of the parental monitoring and control, which may also affect its influence on them. Okay, so the results of this study are important because they have implications for family-oriented clinical practices and also culturally relevant parent interventions. However, there are some limitations that need to be taken into account, and the results should be interpreted in the following context. So first, this was cross-sectional data, so we cannot imply causation. Future studies using longitudinal data can show how these relationships change over time. The study also consisted of youth reports only, so future studies using dyadic data could provide the parent's point of view, especially on that parental monitoring aspect. And lastly, the majority of participants were born in the United States. Future studies should focus on analyzing these associations among immigrant adolescents, and then possibly compare them to US-born adolescents because they may experience acculturation differently and a culture of stress because they were not necessarily born into this dominant culture and had more time to adapt. They were just kind of thrown into this situation and now have to adapt differently. And that is it.
All right, thanks, Deziah. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Great job, both on the study and the test.
Thank you.
I have a question about the decision to make a composite score.
Right. Yes.
I'm curious if studies those might be different.
Sure. So the reason why I decided to create a composite score was because the rule-breaking measure actually had items in it about binge drinking. So we found that it was appropriate to remove those items because they were asked just a little differently. I feel like it was more clear in the binge drinking measure that we did include. And then since they were scored on the same scale, we decided that it was just appropriate to include together. But in the future, yes, it would be interesting to kind of separate not only the alcohol use, but also the substance use, which wasn't included in the current study. That would also provide a little more clarity. No problem.
Other questions?
Very nice presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, like, is there any difference between socio-economically well family versus underprivileged family, financial status of the family?
Right.
And if the parents themselves experience stress?
Right, that would be, I forgot to mention, this was a secondary data set. So socioeconomic status plays a huge role, especially when it comes to stress levels, no matter what kind of stress it is. So I do feel like it would have a significant impact, not only on parental stress, but also on the youth stress as well, because another part of Latinx culture that's not included in this study is something called familial obligation, where they feel obligated to help their family, especially in financially stressed kind of situations. that would be incredibly interesting to include in the study. Unfortunately, I was unable to do that just because I was limited to what factors I could include. But yes, I definitely see your point. I think it would have an impact. No problem.
All right, any final questions? All right, thank you, Deziah.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Valentina Iturriaga, and her major professor is also Dr. Gonzalez-Bakken. Her presentation today is going to be about acculturative stress and Latinx adolescent adjustment, the role of ethnic, racial socialization, and parental involvement.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Valentina Iturriaga, and I'll be presenting on acculturative stress and Latina adolescent adjustment, also exploring the potential role of racial ethnic socialization and parental involvement. I have no conflicts of interest associated with this presentation. So acculturation is a process of adjustment that takes place when individuals are navigating a new culture. And it can involve changes such as changes in cultural attitudes and beliefs. And during this process of adjustment, as individuals navigate this, they might encounter conflicts between their host culture and their native culture that they're in. So this can include conflicts such as having to adjust to a new language, maybe experiencing racial ethnic discrimination, and having to adjust to new unfamiliar values and norms. Now, typically acculturative stress is studied among immigrant populations, and in the United States, a large part of that is research on Latina adolescents. So Latina adolescents in the US do in fact report high rates of acculturative stress, and it's been linked to both internalizing symptoms in the form of depression and rule-breaking behaviors. Another fact about Latino adolescents in the US is that they report disproportionately high rates of depressive symptoms and rule-breaking behaviors. And some scholars believe that this is in part due to their exposure to unique stressors like acculturative stress. Given that Latino adolescents have this heightened risk for developing these depressive symptoms and rule breaking, a lot of research has been devoted to finding potential protective factors that can mitigate the negative aspects of this stress. One of these potential protective factors is racial ethnic socialization or ethnic racial socialization. This is a process by which parents teach adolescents and youth about their cultural background, their identity, and things such as cultural values, traditions, and so on. This process has been found to be central to the development of youth of color because it's believed to help them form a positive self-concept, a positive view of their ethnic group, and overall it's believed that it helps them cope with cultural stressors such as acculturative stress. Another potential protective factor for Latino adolescents is parental involvement. Parental involvement has been measured in different ways in research, but in our particular study, we looked at level of engagement that parents were having with their teens and what kind of activities they're engaging in. Like, are they going to the park together? Are they doing chores together, going to the movies, and so on? There is somewhat less research on parental behavioral involvement with Latinas, but current research does show that it can help curb the development of internalizing symptoms and decrease the occurrence of externalizing symptoms such as rule-breaking behaviors. So based on this current literature, in this study, we wanted to look at whether acculturative stress predicts depressive symptoms and rule-breaking behaviors in a sample of rural Latino adolescents, and whether both racial socialization and parental involvement would mitigate, moderate these associations, mitigating the impact of risk. We hypothesized that acculturative stress would in fact predict depressive symptoms and rule breaking, and that these associations would be moderated by both parenting factors. For data collection in this study, a community-based sample was used. Adolescents completed the surveys in English or Spanish, and they were offered $20 for their participation. There was 5 distinct measures used for this study, and all of them have been found to be reliable in previous studies with Latino adolescents. For participants, we had a total of 198. They were recruited from rural areas of northern Florida and southern Georgia. Most of them were born in the United States. They were predominantly of Mexican origin, and most, as I mentioned, most of them completed their survey in English. Now, on this slide, you can see the results for 2 hierarchical regression models. These were conducted on SPSS, and each model included the outcome of depressive symptoms and rule breakings respectively. We controlled for age, gender, and country of birth. And overall, we found that acculturative stress did predict more levels of depressive symptoms and rule-breaking behaviors in youth. We also found that ethnic racial socialization was associated to a higher occurrence of rule-breaking behaviors, but it was not directly associated with depressive symptoms. And lastly, the only significant moderator in the model was parental involvement, which significantly moderated the association between acculturative stress and both outcomes. So on this slide, you can see the interaction effects for both outcomes. In figure A is depressive symptoms and figure B is rule breaking. And we can see that overall, when parental involvement was low, the association between acculturative stress and both outcomes tended to be stronger. And that is particularly true for rule breaking behaviors. So to sum up some of the results, overall, our results were consistent with previous literature. We found that acculturative stress is a risk factor for Latino adolescents. One important clinical implication from this recommended for school therapists and family therapists is that they begin assessing for these types of stressors in youth, especially if they're working with Latina adolescents or other immigrant groups. Consistent with literature, ethnic socialization was also linked to less rule breaking, but it does not appear to mitigate the negative impact of acculturative stress on outcomes. So more research is needed in that area. And lastly, we found that parental involvement may actually be a protective factor, which I thought was pretty interesting considering that we just looked at activities that parents were doing with their teens. So it'd be interesting to look at what other types of parental involvement could mitigate the negative impact of stress. Now, to sum up, I'll go over some limitations. In this study, we used cross-sectional data. In the future, it's recommended that longitudinal studies are conducted to look at associations over time. I think it'd also be interesting to look at dyadic data and collect information about socialization and parental involvement from both teens and parents. And lastly, I think something else that's important is looking about the diversity of Latinos. So this sample was predominantly of Mexican origin. However, your cultural background and your nationality does have an impact on the way that you experience acculturative stress. So it'd be important to have maybe bigger studies where we could compare. And thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Valentina. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes. Thank you.
I was wondering, does your questionnaire for parental involvement tease out mom or dad, whether one parent's more important than the other?
No, so this was a self-report measure for adolescents and it asked generally parents. So we weren't able to look at whether it was a father, mother, or maybe another parental figure in the household. So I think that would be another really interesting component to add to future studies. Yes.
Very interesting research.
Thank you.
When I researched parental not really a question, but something for you to think about in the future direction. You know, this is adolescent stage. You know, they are encouraged to explore their activity. So I see your parental involvement skills never very often. At some time, too much, right? And it becomes a very source of the teens. So maybe down the road to consider some linear at some point too much. So maybe at some a moderate level of
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that point. That's actually really interesting because when coming up with the study, I think that something that you mentioned is that maybe there could have even been an inverse relationship where involvement made the associations worse. Because as you said, adolescents are needing more autonomy during this year. So I think that's a great thing to consider for future studies. Any other questions? Yes.
It's a very dumb question, but is there any level of parents' involvement which is too much sometimes? For example, I have 2 kids, and if I'm involved too much, they will let it go away. So they get more stress if I'm too much involved.
Yeah.
So is there any categorization that we can make in this kind of data collections? How much involvement was there from parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's kind of related to the previous question where definitely during adolescence, they're typically trying to get a little more autonomy for parents. So it's possible that instead of a higher level of parental involvement being helpful, it could be that a more moderate level is better because it's more consistent with their development at that point. Does that answer your question?
All right, thanks, Valentina.
Thank you.
All right, our third presenter today is Ruth Rodriguez, and her major professor is also Dr. Gonzalez-Bacon. And her presentation today is on the role of depression and role overload on academic achievement among Latinx adolescents. Thanks, Ruth.
Yes. So, oh, are you okay?
We're good.
So yeah, I will be looking at the role of depression and role overload on academic achievement among Latinx adolescents. Hey, see this. Don't really know what happened. It's okay. There you go. All right. I have no conflict of interest. Really not. All right. So first, some background. When it comes to depression and academic achievement, what's been really well established in our field is that higher levels of depressive symptoms are going to be associated with lower levels of academic achievement. When it comes to role overload, not a lot of research has been done on role overload. It's a very new and emerging research area. So we have seen that higher levels of parental expectations have been associated with higher levels of academic success. Higher parental expectations has been a contributing factor to role overload. And this study was done on a Asian adolescent group, and they also looked at depressive symptoms and academic success with the context of parental expectations. And they also found that higher levels of depressive symptoms were associated with higher levels of academic success, which is contrary to what has been established in our field. So, and they had this, they talked about how higher parental expectations is associated with the culture of Asian adolescents. So I wanted to replicate that finding with Latinx adolescents. So when it comes to role overload, again, a lot of the research surrounding role overload centers around the experiences of adults and work-family relationships. And a lot of the times child outcomes are under the perspective of parents' role overload, not the child. But there has been new research that shows higher levels of role overload has been associated with higher levels of depressive symptoms. So the purpose of this study is to build more equitable opportunities for Latinx adolescents and academic achievement. And in order to do this, we need to understand how mental health and role overload play a role in this academic achievement. And the theory that guiding the study was the ecological systems theory. However, I do want to point out I'm using the Tudge et al. Model, which centers culture from the macro system into the micro system because it has the ability to influence day-to-day interactions. Okay, so our hypothesis. The first one was that higher levels of depressive symptoms would be associated with higher levels of academic success, as we saw with the Asian adolescent study. The second hypothesis was that higher levels of depression are going to be associated with higher levels of role overload. And the third hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that I really want to focus on, is that higher levels of role overload are going to strengthen the relationship between depressive symptoms and academic success. And here you can see my conceptual and analytical model. So for the methods, we are really getting our money's worth with this data set. It's the same data set. It's 193 Latinx youth, rural Southeastern United States, majority female, and majority born in the US, and then the mean age was 15.9. So I ran a hierarchical linear regression model. I controlled for gender, age, and binary country of birth. For the measures I used to measure depression, I used the Children's Depression Inventory. For role overload, the adaptation of the role overload scale has been used. And then for academic success, adolescent self-report on school, it was a 9-item ranging from core and elective classes. So for our results, we found that there was a significant interaction between depressive symptoms and row overload on academic success. You can see that right here. We graphed that interaction and we found that for those with higher row overload, there was a positive association between depressive symptoms and academic success. You can see that right here, higher academic success. And meaning that for those with high row overload, higher depressive symptoms were associated with higher levels of academic success. And you may be wondering, why is that the case? Well, it's very much possible that Latinx adolescents who grow up in these rural areas feel added pressure to succeed and continue to gain high academic success despite any depressive symptoms that they're feeling. And you may also be wondering, well, why is that the case? And I think what the important thing to remember is that this culture, the Latinx culture, has a strong emphasis on being very well educated. There's even a term that has been documented in literature surrounding this idea. And we use this phrase called muy buen educado in like social settings. Whenever we want to say that somebody's a well-respected person, we literally call them a well-educated person. So it's possible that this is internalized and we see that academic success is very important among these adolescents. And that also gives us more avenues for future studies to really solidify this idea. So this finding really has the potential to redefine how we view the relationship between depressive symptoms and academic success. And this study also really adds to limited research surrounding row overload. So there are some limitations with this study. The first being that it was a self-report specifically with GPA. There may be more accurate ways to get a really good measure of academic success. Additionally, the majority of the sample was US born, and I predict that those who are immigrants may have a unique level of overload just because they're assimilating into American culture and they're trying to navigate multiple cultures at once. So it may be a little bit more difficult for immigrants, especially recently immigrants. So other confounding variables that can also influence academic success are things like access to resources, school funding, generational status. These have all been established to also impact academic success. So additional research should also consider other confounding variables that may impact depressive symptoms and row overload. Additional research should also just continue to do more research on row overload. It's very limited. And a lot of the studies that I found were done within the past 3 to 5 years. Additionally, replication studies should be done to perform so that we can solidify this really new model of higher or just high depressive symptoms associated with higher levels of academic success. But in the meantime, future interventions and outreach should be really mindful of using what we thought was well established. And we really need to be mindful of just that association between higher levels of depressive symptoms and lower academic success, because this study found that that wasn't the case. All right. Any questions?
Any questions for Ruth? Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. I learned a lot from your research. My question is, quite a few different factors for the discussion, but I was curious with regards to academic success, if you've also considered the role of different majors, different disciplines.
Oh, yes, that's a really good point. This study was done on Latinx youth. So it was, the mean age was 15 years old. So I feel like if you're looking at different majors, you might want to look at a more college sample because there's just core classes that everybody has to take. There's like a set standard that everyone has to take in order to graduate. So I think that would be a really interesting study for college students. Yes.
Just research, I believe that everyone is achieving. Because everyone wants to get a higher level of academic success here. But I want to ask, I say that if I want to get higher level of academic success, I must have to bear more higher level of stress than peers. That's it, right?
So you're asking if you want to look at higher academic success, you also have to look at higher depressive symptoms? Well, it's not, that might not always be the case because of other variables. This study did find with high row overload, So you might want to consider other variables that could also be impacting depressive symptoms, and that's the opportunity for future studies. But I think we just need to be mindful of, normally we associate high levels of depression with lower academic success, and this wasn't the case. So we really need to be careful about continuing with that and really take a look at what's happening.
Any last minute questions? All right, thank you, Ruth. All right, our final presenter today is going to be Trinity Johnston, and her major professor, someone different, is Dr. Bermudez. And her presentation today is on work to family spillover, mindfulness, and their impact on well-being in working parents. Take it out, Trinity.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning. I am Trinity Johnston, and as Katie mentioned, I'm going to be talking about work to family spillover, mindfulness, and their impact on the well-being of working parents. I have no potential or actual conflicts of interest with this presentation. So to begin, mindfulness is a state of awareness that really arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And within the literature on mindfulness, we see a lot of positive benefits and positive outcomes on individuals because of mindfulness association with a state of mind that is comprised of calmness, gratitude, and compassion. And so moving forward, work to family spillover is the extent to which occupational obligations either interfere with or supplement family life. So within this study, we break that down into negative and positive work to family spillover. Negative work to family spillover being when occupational obligations interfere with family life, home life. So maybe you had a bad day at work, right? And you come home and the interactions with your family are more negative because of that. On the flip side, positive work to family spillover, the exact opposite. So occupational obligations supplement family life. So if you had a good day, if you had a raise that day, you might have better interactions at home. And then lastly, well-being, the experience of emotional responses and the personal perception of life satisfaction. And well-being is a pretty broad and big concept, right? So we broke it down to positive affect, negative affect, and life satisfaction based on some literature that suggests that those three really interact to create well-being. And the existing literature defines a relationship between these variables. What we see most commonly is positive relationships between mindfulness and well-being, and then negative relationships between negative work to family spillover and well-being. What is not as much studied within this area is the effects of positive work to family spillover on well-being, and as well as looking at mindfulness and work to family spillover together. And so for our sample, we focused on working married parents because when compared to single parents or even single individuals, working married parents have more work family strain. And we used a subsample from the midlife in the United States data set for our analysis. So the purpose of this study was to look at how mindfulness and positive and negative work to family spillover act as predictors for different aspects of well-being, right? So that was the positive affect, negative affect, and life satisfaction. So our first hypothesis was that individuals with higher levels of mindfulness would have higher levels of life satisfaction and positive affect and lower levels of negative affect. And then our second hypothesis is that individuals with higher levels of negative work to family spillover would have lower levels of life satisfaction and positive affect and higher levels of negative affect. And then our final hypothesis was that individuals with higher levels of positive work to family spillover would have higher levels of life satisfaction and positive affect and lower levels of negative affect. Okay. So for our preliminary analyses, these are just going to be the product moment correlations between the focal variables. You'll see here at the top I don't know how to do laser. Here it is. Okay, laser. The number of children, gender, education, income. Yeah, so we included those variables because the literature suggests that the levels of work to family spillover as well as well-being are going to range depending on those factors. So as you can see, all substantial correlations were between small and medium in size. The bolded ones are particularly of importance. So here when we look at positive work-family spillover, we can see that it was positively correlated with mindfulness and positive affect and life satisfaction. And then when we look at negative work-family spillover, we can see that it was negatively correlated with positive affect and life satisfaction, but it was positively correlated with negative affect. And again, when we look at mindfulness, lastly, when we look at mindfulness, we can see that it was positively correlated with positive affect and positively correlated with life satisfaction. One thing to note here, the correlations between negative affect and positive work-family spillover, and then negative affect and mindfulness were not significant. And we can kind of touch on that a little bit later. In terms of the control variables, we can see that positive work-family spillover positively correlated with income and education. I think, yeah, it's a little sideways, hard to see. Such that increased work-family spillover was correlated with higher income, higher education. Negative work-family spillover, we see the same thing, positively correlated with education and income. Oh boy, okay. And then with mindfulness, again, we can see that it is positively correlated with number of children. So correlated with more children and negatively correlated with income. Okay. So we did an ordinary least squares regression. And again, I want to draw your attention to the bolded numbers. So when looking at positive work-family spillover, we can see that greater positive work-family spillover was associated with greater positive affect and greater life satisfaction. We see that the association with negative affect was not significant. When we look at negative work-family spillover, we see that greater negative work-family spillover was associated with decreased positive affect, increased negative affect, and decreased life satisfaction. And then when looking at mindfulness, we see that greater mindfulness was associated with increased positive affect and increased life satisfaction. And so the significant findings here are all as hypothesized, as we expected. The thing that is interesting about these findings is within the negative affect piece. So you see that the positive work-family spillover and mindfulness, we expect there to be positive outcomes on a negative component of well-being, but those findings were not significant. I think this is what really should propel the research further, is to examine how positive characteristics and behaviors can influence negative components of well-being. Just watching the clock there.
Questions for Trinity?
One obvious question will be, what kind of work, the kind of work that you do with someone has a relatively stable job or someone is doing multiple shifts, even if the income is same, but is there any data on the type of work?
Yeah. Yes, so that is within limitations. I think that's a great way to propel this further, is to look at how different jobs and how different demands, right, occupational demands can influence this spillover, because obviously having, hours, you mentioned work hours, so obviously working more hours is probably going to more negatively affect the home life. And I don't think there's as much literature on that, but I definitely think it's an area that should be looked into further.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes.
surface, was it taken into account whether or not the person surveyed was the predominant money earner in the household or not?
No, that was not question. All we just asked was income and education. But I definitely see how that could influence, right, the work family strain, the levels of spillover. I think it also influenced well-being in a whole nother way that wasn't considered.
Any other questions?
I just have a curiosity, if we can go back to the previous slide. It's not a question, just a query, like the correlation household total income with life satisfaction. So 3 stars means highly significant, but it says 0.00. So I don't know how to interpret that. Is it positive correlation, negative, or is it correlation?
So as you can see, that's another limitation. All of the effect sizes are very small, right? And even here, it very, very, very small.
Still very significant.
Right. It was still shown as significant, just a very small effect size. Just like with these, you know, I mean, these are still very small effect sizes, but they were still significant, meaning there is an association. It's just small. The data set was very large. I want to say it was a very large sample, 1,700 participants. So I'm sure like those small effect sizes we see because of that, because it's so much variation. I'm sure more control maybe in a study could have shown a little bit like bigger effect sizes, if that makes sense.
So are these p-values are corrected in a way so this effect sizes considered like it's corrected for?
Right. I think if we would have considered more variables within the study, we might have gotten more higher effect sizes or more, I guess, just more specific sample. It's a very broad sample that we looked at. So.
All right, thank you, Trinity.